Chavismo and the revolution came to power in 1998. By 2002, the U.S. was angrily trying to coup them on a regular basis. Here's from Democracy Now! In 2002. April 2002, at around 10 p.m., members of the military high command arrived at the palace in Venezuela to demand Chavez's resignation. Chavez was refusing to sign a resignation, and in response, the generals were threatening to bomb the palace. Film crew happened to be there because they were filming Chavez in just making a movie about him, and they happened to be there during this coup. So there's video of some of this, and in one of the quotes in the video, you hear one of the officials say the CIA is behind this. Everyone knows it. We have proof of plans for a coup. Then the filmmaker says at about 3:30 a.m., one of the ministers came out to talk to us. Chavez had decided to hand himself over to the generals to avoid bombing of the palace, but he was still refusing to resign as president. Chavez was led away. 1 hour later, Venezuela awoke to a new regime and an extraordinary TV moment in which it was all revealed. Then the palace we had fled only hours before was now the scene of celebrations and backslapping by the coup leaders and their cronies. So the coup leaders are all excited. They've kidnapped Chavez. They've won they've taken over Venezuela, despite the blackout by Venezuelan private media. So part of the problem during that coup was that corporate media owned almost all the media in Venezuela at the time. So they were able to create a blackout that only allowed propaganda, right-wing propaganda, to come through. But despite that blackout, members of Chavez's government had managed to communicate with international television networks, getting the message back to Venezuela via cable TV that Chavez had not resigned and was being held captive. Very quickly, the word began to spread across the country. Millions of people took to the streets when they found out Chavez had not resigned and had been kidnapped. With so many people in the streets, the palace guard, who had remained loyal to Chavez, decided to act. Behind Carmona's back, he was the coup leader, a plot had been hatched by Chavez's men to retake the palace. The plan was for the guard to take up key positions, surround the palace, and to wait for a given signal. With all their positions secured, the signal was given and the presidential guard moved in. Several members of the newly installed government were taken prisoner, but Carmona and the generals managed to slip away. So that is how Chavez got back into power. The coup only lasted 2 days, and he got back into power. That was the 2002 U.S.-backed coup attempt. Ultimately, Chavez dies, I believe, in 2012 from cancer. For those of you who aren't familiar, it is not that difficult for the CIA to cause cancer in people. They likely did it with Jack Ruby, the man who killed Oswald. He came down with a very quick-acting cancer when he was about to leave prison and about to start speaking more publicly. It's not impossible to create cancer in people. Eva Gollinger, who's a journalist, I spoke to her. I interviewed her once at Redacted Tonight, and she's the one who revealed the actual paperwork showing that the CIA was involved in the 2002 coup against Chavez. She was the one who found that through a FOIA request. I was able to find irrefutable evidence using the U.S. Freedom of Information Act that the CIA and other U.S. agencies were behind the coup and supported financially, militarily, and politically those involved. Later on, there were other attempts against Chavez and his government, such as in 2004, when dozens of Colombian paramilitary forces were captured on a farm outside of Caracas that was owned by an anti-Chavez activist, Robert Alonso, just days before they were going to attack the presidential palace and kill Chavez. There was another lesser-known plot against him discovered in New York City during his visit to the UN General Assembly in September 2006. According to information provided by his security services, during standard security reconnaissance of an event where Chavez would address the U.S. public at a local renowned university, high levels of radiation were detected in the chair where he would have sat. So he comes to New York to speak at the UN. He's also going to speak at a university. I don't know which one. The chair that he's expected to sit in is discovered to have very high radiation in it. The radiation was discovered by a Geiger counter that his security brings with them, handheld radiation detection device that the president's security had. In this case, the chair was removed, and subsequent tests showed it was emanating unusual amounts of radiation that could have resulted in significant harm to Chavez had it gone undiscovered. Now, I don't know if you know this. chairs rarely just become radioactive. It's very uncommon that a chair just decides to be radioactive one day. Someone needs to make a chair radioactive. And in order to make a chair radioactive, you'd have to have access to the chair. I mean, you know, there is, I suppose, some possibility that it was like, you know, Dick Cheney sat in that chair beforehand and like ripped a major one that turned the chair radioactive. Totally possible, but fairly unlikely. Not that Dick Cheney would do that, just that he was in that chair right before. This means someone has to actively be turning a chair radioactive to try and give Chavez cancer. It's also, and obviously if it succeeded, if they weren't checking things with a Geiger counter before he sits in them, if it had succeeded, it's the kind of the perfect assassination because no one sees anyone do anything. He comes down with cancer months later and doesn't know why. And there's really no way you can blame anyone. And anyone who then goes on to blame someone looks like they're making what are you, crazy? Gave him cancer? According to accounts by the presidential security of the event, an individual from the U.S. who had been involved in the logistical support for the event had provided the chair and was shown to be acting with U.S. intelligence agents. That gives a lot of evidence to the idea, at least, that Chavez could be assassinated with cancer if they had attempted it. Someone had attempted it. Even if you want to say, oh, it wasn't the U.S., it was probably someone else. Someone had attempted it prior to when he got cancer. Some of the pieces that have been coming together include the discovery of several close aides to Chavez who had private, unobstructed access to him over prolonged periods, who fled the country after his death and are collaborating with the U.S. government. If he were assassinated by some kind of exposure to high levels of radiation or otherwise inoculated or infected by cancer-causing virus, it would have been done by someone with close access to him who he trusted. She then goes through a few of the possibilities. Limzy Salazar was one of Chavez's closest aides for nearly 7 years. He was lieutenant colonel in the Venezuelan Navy. But shockingly, in December 2014, that's after Chavez's death, news reports revealed that Limzy had secretly been flown to the U.S. from Spain, where he was allegedly on vacation with his family. The plane that flew him was said to be from the DEA, and then he was placed into the Witness Protection Program. Chavez's high-level former aide who was around him all the time gets placed into U.S. Witness Protection Program. And I assume is still wandering around the U.S. right now, but his name is Albert Smith. And he has a fake mustache on top of his real mustache. Look around for an Albert who used to be Chavez's assistant. There's some of the possibilities of how Chavez could have been assassinated. But let's move forward a few years to the drone explosion in front of Nicolas Maduro that was also linked back to the U.S. So you can ignore a little bit the CNN propaganda talking, but I'm going to leave the sound on.
It was fireworks first, but it was a drone bomb, a brazen assassination attempt against Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. The first bid to kill a world leader with commercial drone technology bought online. It could have killed everyone on the stage.
It fails, obviously, and the U.S. media then does overtime talking about how, oh no, the guy who sent that drone was just a kooky guy who liked to kill presidents and not connected to the U.S. and et cetera, because suddenly U.S. media cared a lot about the origins of this drone bomb, where they don't actually care about most anything that happens in other countries. And then, of course, there was the one I haven't gotten to yet, the announcing of Juan Guaido as president of Venezuela. I'm not going to go through all the details. Most of you know them. The U.S. and the countries the U.S. is able to bully into it all announce that Juan Guaido, a man who received 0 votes for president of Venezuela, is now the president of Venezuela. And then all of the U.S. media jumps behind it. Here's New York Times. Back then, they say, who is Venezuela's legitimate president? It's a messy dispute. Oh, is it? A messy dispute? Really? Considering some rando who went to Georgetown. I mean, this guy, Juan Guaido, was completely raised, fostered as a U.S. asset. went to Georgetown. His like mentor was formerly very high up in ExxonMobil. It's just like everything about Juan Guaido just reeked of this like U.S. CIA asset. The U.S. then goes on to steal the billions of dollars from Citgo, the Venezuelan gas company, and give it to Juan Guaido and his minions, or give a lot of it to them. So they just cash out. They just become crazy rich. They're supposed to use that money to try and bring down Maduro. During this time, there was the occupation of the Venezuelan embassy, the holding of the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C., where I lived at the time. And I was a part of that. Proud to say. I was there, and me and many of my friends and awesome people, awesome activists. It was that occupation was spearheaded by Margaret Flowers and Kevin Zeese. Kevin Zeese has since passed away. They didn't just decide on their own that they would just take over the Venezuelan embassy. They were invited by the government of Venezuela as Americans to hold the Venezuelan embassy for the Venezuelan government of Maduro. The U.S. decided to steal the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C., and claim it belonged to Juan Guaido, even though Juan Guaido was not the president. During that holding of the embassy, it went on for like a month and a half. I can't remember the exact number of days. They cut off the power. They cut off they surrounded the place with loud music and all this shit, and bright flashing lights, and far right wing, like lunatic anti-Maduro protesters in America encircled the building and tried to throw things at people, tried to attack supporters of Venezuela's sovereignty. And you could tell they were far right wing. I mean, some of them were shown to have links to Raytheon, etc. But you could tell they were far right wing because their view of a really powerful insult, like that was going to really hurt you, was to yell like the most offensive terms for gay or lesbian. I'm not going to repeat them, but to yell the N-word, and that is what they viewed as like, oh, I'm going to really get them. I'm going to call them mean names that mean they're gay. They don't seem to realize that we've advanced. Most of society has advanced past that. So it lasted for well over a month. And then the U.S. decided eventually to go into the embassy, which is illegal under international law, and arrest the 4 remaining people there, Kevin Zeese and Margaret Flowers and David Paul and Adrian Pine were the 4 remaining people. Now, many had volunteered to help, but ultimately they decided that because you need resources to exist in a building, it should only be a few people remaining in there. And they have never given that embassy back to Venezuela. The U.S. has continued to break international law and continues to own Venezuela's embassy in the United States. Let's jump to the Bay of Piglets. The last U.S. coup attempt, other than what's going on right now. The Bay of Piglets attempt under Donald Trump. A bunch of mercenaries, just paid soldiers, some of them U.S. Special Forces, try and invade Venezuela on small crafts, small motorboats, and they're basically stopped by fishermen. I mean, like, fishermen see them and alert, like, the Coast Guard or whatever the Venezuelan equivalent is, and they're stopped rather easily, arrested, put in prison. On Sunday, May 3rd, the government, Nicolas Maduro, announced Venezuela's armed forces had repelled an armed incursion. Operation Gideon was a deeply flawed coup attempt, but what would compel exiled Venezuelans and former U.S. Special Forces to join a plan like this? Well, it was signed off on by Juan Guaido, the U.S. puppet. He actually signed the letter that said, yep, we'll take the money and you can go and destroy the government of Venezuela. And it was led by this maniac, Silver Corps founder Jordan Goudreau, who was supposed to be part of it, but then didn't show up on the day of. I wonder why. I think he knew that it was not going to go well. By the way, his other business, the other business Silver Corps does is offering to train like schools with like young kids how to deal with active shooters. So he's making his money by like trying to teach kids to deal with active shooters, and then he's also setting up mercenary invasions of Venezuela done by Donald Trump and Juan Guaido.